I told you at the beginning of our last lesson that 2 Samuel chapter 5 is positively flowing over with information, with issues that are so easy to rush right by, but they're quite important to our overall progression as we go through the Bible. And so we were going to make a few detours to help explain matters, and we spent a great deal of time last week discussing and defining terms for that ancient city that most represents Israel, Jerusalem. And we learned that the oldest known name for that place is Yerushalayim. And that name, surprisingly, is not Hebrew. It's Akkadian. The term Yerushalayim was represented in clay tablets found in northern Syria in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And the tablets were written in Akkadian about 4,500 years ago, or 500 years before the time of Abraham. Now it means something like the foundation of the god Shalem. And so an abbreviated name for that city was Shalem. And we find that this is the name of the place, or at least one of the names of the place, that was in use at the time of Abraham's encounter with that mysterious king and priest Melchizedek. And further, a clan or a tribe named Jebus eventually conquered or built up Yerushalayim, and they walled off a section of it. So Jebus and Yerushalayim were both common names for the same place and in use at the same time. This walled off section built by the Jebusites was called Zion. It was this walled off section that we find David and his private army conquering in 2 Samuel chapter 5, and then renaming it the city of David. Now, since David took Zion with his own men, and he didn't involve the national tribal troops, he felt free to assign a personal name to his new capital city, the city of David, because in fact, that became his private estate. We need to get the picture that Yerushalayim was the name for the general area, and that the city of David was the name for that walled city that resided on a portion of that area. That area lay downhill on the southern slope of Mount Moriah. Those of you that have been there can kind of get the picture of it. Up here is the Temple Mount. Then there's an open area where there's a lot of archaeological digs. You cross, there's a street now that runs through here, runs right through here now. Then you come to the city of David, which is down the hill, and eventually you get down to the valley below, all right, which is the Kidron Valley. So, as we study the Bible, understand that the city of David was not synonymous with Jerusalem. And as we go forward in the Bible, we need to keep that in mind. We're going to revisit this subject as we arrive eventually at the time of King Solomon, building that first permanent temple for Jehovah atop the crest of Mount Moriah, which is located, if you'll notice, outside the city of David. It's not within the walled portion. So let's reread a portion of 2 Samuel chapter 5 to kind of get our bearings for this evening's lesson. Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 5, page 339 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. And we're going to start reading at verse 6. The king and his men went to Jerusalem to attack the Yebusi, the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the region. And they taunted David. You won't get in here. Even the blind and the lame could fend you off. In other words, they were thinking David will never get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion. Also known now as the city of David. And what David said on that day was, in order to attack the Jebusites, you must have to climb up from the spring outside the city through the water tunnel. Then you can do away with these so-called lame and blind, whom David despises, hence the expression, the lame and blind keep him from entering the house. David lived in the stronghold, and he called it the city of David. Then David built up the city around it, starting at the Millo and working inward. And David grew greater and greater because Adonai, the God of armies, was with him. And Hiram, the king of Zor, sent envoys to David with cedar logs, and with them were carpenters and stonemasons, and they built David a palace. And David then knew that Adonai had set him as king over Israel and increased his royal power for the sake of his people. David took for himself more concubines and wives in Jerusalem after coming from Hebron, so that still more sons and daughters were born to David. And here are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Natan, Shlomo, Yivchar, Elishua, Nepheg, Yafia, Elishma, Eliada, and Eliphelet. And when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David, and on learning of it, David went down to the stronghold. The Philistines came and they deployed in the Rephaim valley. David consulted Adonai, asking, should I attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And Adonai answered David, attack. I will certainly hand the Philistines over to you. So David went to Baal Pratzim and defeated them there. And he said, Adonai has broken through my enemies for me like a river breaking through its banks. This is why he called the place Baal Pratzim, the Lord of breaking through. The Philistines had left their idols there, so David and his men took them away. The Philistines came up again and deployed in the Rephaim valley. And when David consulted Adonai, he said, don't attack. Circle behind them and engage them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, advance. Because then Adonai has gone out ahead of you to defeat the army of the Philistines. David did it exactly as Adonai had ordered him to do. And he pursued his attack on the Philistines from Geba all the way to Gezer. Well, starting in verse 6, we get a very brief account of the conquering of the Jebusite-held walled city of Zion. So we get frustratingly little detail that is so typical of biblical narrative when it comes to talking about battles. The thing that's striking about this event is that the writer of this narrative focuses on the apparently insulting words that the Jebusites hurled at David from behind the safety of their massive fortress walls, and from David's side, the clever means that David used to gain entrance inside the stronghold. Now let's start with the latter first. It seems that David used a water tunnel to more or less sneak his men into the city. And this tunnel, or really more of a shaft, was first rediscovered in the modern age by Sir Charles Warren in 1867 and has been aptly named Warren Shaft. And it neatly verifies the biblical account of David's conquest of Zion. And here we'll take another detour, because this is not the last time that the water system of Jerusalem plays a pivotal role in history. As an archaeology buff, I find this stuff fascinating. I kind of hope you do too as well. The city of David was built on a hill of hard limestone in which running underground water would form natural caves. And the Gihon Spring is the only source of water for the city. And it emerges in the Kidron Valley on the east side of the city of David. And it's mentioned many times in the Bible, and this valuable water source is what made the founding of the city of David, formerly Zion, built by the Jebusites, possible. And it sustains its existence for thousands of years. Now, the Hebrew name of the spring, Gihon, is derived from a verb meaning to gush or gush forth, reflecting the very rapid flow of this spring, which tends to vary with the seasons of the year and the amount of annual rainfall. Now, this particular spring operates in a fascinating way. First, the water accumulates in a subterranean cave area. Then that cave behaves like a water cistern, a reservoir. And then it fills to the brim, and then it empties out, it overspills, goes through cracks in the rock by means of capillary action, and that water then from capillary action is kind of siphoned up to the surface. And this natural feature made it necessary to accumulate the water in a pool so that there would be water available in the seasons when the spring wasn't Gihon, gushing forth. The Gihon spring emerged in a cave on the eastern slope of the city of David above the Kidron Valley. And over the centuries, the various inhabitants of this walled city found it important to protect their water supply from enemies and to increase the amount of water available, because until there was more water, the population couldn't grow. Therefore, 3 different man-made water systems, all fed by the Gihon spring, were carved into the rock underneath the city of David. And they are the most complex and advanced of any known from the biblical era. All 3 water systems at one point were in operation simultaneously during the First Temple period, for instance. And each contributed to the efficiency and the capacity of the city's water supply. And they also attest to the efforts of the kings of ancient Jerusalem to guarantee that water supply in case there was a siege. Now, in times of war and siege, the city's water supply was vulnerable because the Gihon spring in the Kidron Valley was outside the city walls. And various means, including these tunnels and shafts, were designed to try to solve that problem. What is today called Warren Shaft is the earliest of these subterranean water systems. And the entrance to Warren Shaft is located in the middle of the eastern slope of the city of David, inside of those ancient city walls. It consisted of a subterranean rock-cut tunnel with a shaft at its end, and at the entrance the tunnel slopes steeply downward in a stepped passage. But all of this leaves us with the question, how did David's men get inside this water shaft if it was located inside of the city walls? The questions caused a lot of scholars to question the reliability of this account, to wonder maybe if the translation is incorrect. But let's leave that matter open for a little while we take the time to understand how this system became expanded in later times. The next facility to be built is called the Siloam Channel, but it's also known as the Canaanite Tunnel. It was cut at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, and it emerges from the Gihon spring and extends about 1/4 of a mile southward along the low eastern slope of the city of David, around the city's southern end, and then it empties into a reservoir in the Tyropian Valley. Now, the channel's northern part is 3 feet deep, and it's covered by large stones. and the southern part is open, but becomes a rock-cut tunnel towards the end of it. Openings along the channel allowed water to flow out and irrigate then the terraces on the eastern slope of the city of David. These, by the way, were David's private gardens. Now, the third and last water system to be constructed goes by a name that's familiar to us: Hezekiah's Tunnel. That tunnel was cut during the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah, about the end of the 8th century BC. And it's described in detail in a 6-line inscription written in a very early Hebrew language script that was cut literally into the rock near the exit of the tunnel. And it begins like this: breakthrough. And this is the account of the breakthrough. While the laborers were still working with their picks, each towards the other, and while there were still 3 cubits to be broken through, the voice of each was heard calling to the other, because there was a crack in the rock to the south and to the north. And at the moment of the breakthrough, the laborers struck each towards the other, pick against pick. Then the water flowed from the pool, from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits, and at the height of the rock above the head of the laborers, it was 100 cubits. Now this was 1,200 cubits is probably around 1,800 feet, something like that. It has to be the most impressive of the water systems built in the city of David. The tunnel was cut into the rock beneath the city of David for over a half a mile in a kind of a S serpentine shape. Even more, in order to hurry to finish this tunnel, it was dug from each end, and they managed to meet in the middle perfectly, which is what this inscription that I just finished reading to you is explaining. How they did that without modern instruments is just amazing. The average width of the tunnel is about 2 feet, and it's about 6 feet high, maybe a little under, along most of its course. Now, this final water system is what feeds the very newly discovered and very large pool of Siloam that we read about in the New Testament. I've been in both the Canaanite tunnel and Hezekiah's tunnel, and I didn't like it. Believe me, it's not for the faint of heart. I can also tell you that the tunnels are amazing. And it's hard to imagine that they were built using the most primitive of tools. The flow of water in the winter especially is substantial. And one can understand how a sizable city could grow from only the water supplied by that single spring to get home. Well, let's move now to the second focal point of this chapter. The words spoken to David and his army by the inhabitants, Jebusites, of this walled fortress city. Now, as big a mystery as to how David was able to get into that water tunnel and get into Zion is the meaning behind the words of those residents of Zion, again, the Jebusites, who taunted David's army by saying that even the lame and the blind could fend them off. Thus, I don't think very many Bible translations agree with one another on this point. And so if we did some comparisons, we'd find slightly different translational meanings assigned to those words from version to version. And further, if we look down to verse 8, chapter 5, the passage ends with yet another statement about the lame and the blind, and it seems to be saying that David is disgusted and he's repelled by people who are lame and blind. He just doesn't like lame and blind people. That's what it seems to be saying. So when the two statements about the lame and the blind of Jerusalem are taken together, we get a mystery. The most popular assumption is that these are simply insulting words thrown at David by the Jebusite soldiers who were standing in their defensive positions atop the city walls. And that David's retort about him despising the lame and the blind is sarcasm being thrown back at them in return. But another theory is that lame and blind people were actually brought to the scene, lined up on the walls of the city, and they hurled insults at David. And so David made it clear that when he entered the city, he wasn't going to look upon them with mercy the way you would normally expect that a warrior would deal with severely disabled people. Yet another approach is from the rabbis. The rabbis say that the lame and the blind were pagan idols that the Jebusites placed along the walls as talisman to place a curse on David and his troops. Rashi has another solution. He says that the inhabitants were descendants of Abimelech, and that the lame and the blind were two statues, one who symbolized Jacob, who was made lame by that all-night wrestling match with the angel of the Lord, and the other symbolized Isaac, who became blind in his latter years, and then he'd been easily tricked by Jacob. So David despises those statues, and he plans on destroying them. Now there are also a few other theories that rely on what's called Hittite mythology to solve this riddle. Some scholars just say the text is corrupted. So this is the reason we get this strange wording and what is otherwise unintelligible thought. But the Dead Sea Scrolls say essentially the same thing. So, whatever we're reading must be right. We're just not understanding it correctly. What are we going to make of this issue? With this strange emphasis on the lame and the blind. I think the problem can be solved by incorporating the biblical principle of progressive revelation. We need to look to the entire Bible and not just focus on this particular passage in an isolated way. Using the progressive revelation principle, let's remember who David presages: the Messiah. And whether one adheres to Judaism or Christianity, David is the model or type for the future Messiah. In both religions, the Messiah must come from David's line. So, I see this issue about the lame and the blind in the same light as we see some of David's songs: prophetic and messianic. Not until we have the New Testament does the key to unlock the mystery of these words spoken in 2 Samuel chapter 5 appear. Listen to this passage from Matthew 11, verses 4 through 6. Yeshua answered, "Go and tell Yochanan, John, what you are hearing and seeing. The blind are seeing again, the lame are walking, people with Sarat, skin diseases, are being cleansed, the deaf are hearing, the dead are being raised, the good news is being told to the poor, on how blessed is anyone not offended by me." And then later in Matthew 15, verse 31, the people were amazed as they saw mute people speaking, crippled people cured, lame people walking, blind people seeing, and they said a barakah, a praise, a blessing to the God of Israel. Now, I think it's hard not to see the connection to David's descendant Yeshua triumphantly entering into Jerusalem and healing who? The lame and the blind. And in 2 Samuel chapter 5, I see the people of Jerusalem saying to David on one level, and to Messiah on another level, that unless you are the one who can heal the lame and the blind, you're not welcome here. And the response of both David and Messiah is that they despise blindness and lameness that's harmed these people. In other words, where many translators have David saying he despises lame and blind people, which would be kind of out of character for God's anointed, what we really have is David saying that he despises the condition of lameness and blindness. And so when Jesus speaks in Matthew 11:6 and says, "How blessed is anyone not offended to me," and he's referring to the blind and the lame, this all fits hand in glove with David's response to the people in Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 5, verse 8. In any case, David conquers Zion, and we learn that he set about to expand the city. And his first step was to start building at the terraced area at the north end of the city, just outside the city walls. It was called the Milo at that time, and in later times it became known as the Ophel. Well, homes were built in this area that lay between the city of David and the crest of the hill that's known as Mount Moriah, where the temple would someday be constructed. And in time, the walls of the city of David were added onto to incorporate this new housing area that was built on up the hill into David's compound. But verse 10 recenters the entire narrative by reminding the listeners that David's success was actually Jehovah's doing. David was just a participant. David grew greater because God was faithful to his word for his own name's sake. And David sees and he acknowledges that. I believe that this is the key to godly success in life. Act in cooperation with the Lord. Give him all the glory, because whatever victories that come will be his. In my 6+ decades on this earth, I've known and observed many good people who have worked very hard, made sound judgments, but things just never worked out for them. Substantially more often than not, when things were on the upswing in their lives, they credited their own wisdom and hard work as the reason. And David knew that his own hard work and courage was definitely needed to become a king, to rule God's kingdom as a king. But the results, the outcome of all of his efforts, was going to be totally dependent on the Lord. And that's the same attitude that we as worshipers of the God of Israel need to approach life. And so next we hear that David sets about building a palace for himself. And King Hiram of Zor sent cedar logs, especially along with especially skilled craftsmen. And he sent them to David to aid in constructing a proper palace for the king of Israel. Now, Zor is just another name for Tyre, capital of Phoenicia. And while the story seems to make the construction of David's palace a nearly immediate event after he conquered Zion, in fact, it must have happened later on in David's reign. It's not at all unusual in Scripture for events to be placed in an order that just doesn't have much regard to time. And we know that David reigned until about 960 BC, and the king Hiram didn't begin his reign over Phoenicia until about 970 BC. So somewhere in between those two dates is when this palace construction began. Now the cedars of Lebanon are proverbial because cedar was such an admired, it was such a valuable wood in the Middle East. Cedar was as beautiful as it was durable. It was strong enough to be used for load bearing, and it was lovely enough to be used for exquisite interior paneling. And as early as 3000 BC, cedar was being exported from Phoenicia to Egypt. That's how prized this wood is. Cedar wood was in such demand that by the time of David, the cedar forests were almost depleted. And so it was a very precious, expensive commodity that was reserved for only the wealthiest aristocrats and kings. This passage implies that David apparently had some kind of a very good relationship with the Phoenicians. And it must have served some kind of an economic purpose that was mutually beneficial. Phoenicia lay along the Mediterranean coast. The Phoenicians were seafarers and they were merchants. But a people who relies on shipping and trading for their economy need stuff to sell. Wine and olive oil produced in Israel was highly prized. So it made sense for Israel to form an alliance with Phoenicia. And then verse 13 adds to the overall picture of what occurred once David acquired his new capital city. Once he was settled in the city of David, David moved his harem from Hebron to Jerusalem, and he even added to it with more wives and concubines. Now let me remind you, a concubine wasn't some sort of sex slave or a plaything for a man. Rather, a concubine was like a wife, but usually she didn't receive a marriage document, so we have to think of her kind of like a second-class wife. Now, a concubine, especially in the case of kings, was often the handmaiden for an aristocratic woman that the king would marry to create a needed or a wanted political alliance with some king or another. And the list of names of David's sons represents only the firstborns from each of those mothers. Many daughters, many other sons were born as well to those women of his harem. David was creating quite a dynasty of loyal leaders for his administration, his own children. But what of David's jilted friends, the Philistines? See, up to now, the Philistines had not deemed David to be a threat to them. And this was due primarily to the strong relationship he had established some years earlier with Achish, king of Gath, when David was a guest in Philistine territory. Remember when he lived in Ziklag? They apparently looked upon him as kind of like a trusted vassal when he left Philistia to return to Judah. So no doubt David let them continue in that fiction, because as he was consolidating his power over Israel, the last thing he needed was a confrontation with the Philistines to distract him. Being made king over Judah would have raised eyebrows among the 5 Philistine lords, but upon being crowned over Israel, as king over Israel, any pretense of vassal status to them vanished. So the Philistines attacked. Now, was it to punish David for what in their eyes was his rebellion against them? Probably that was at the heart of it. But also, no doubt, it was to keep David from achieving the full political unity of all the Israelite tribes and clans that Saul had never been able to achieve. Philistia wanted to keep Israel destabilized. A united Israel was a lot bigger threat than an on-again, off-again coalition of tribes. A united Israel wasn't going to be so easy to lord over for the Philistines as a fractured Israel. And when David heard that the Philistines were coming for him, he removed himself to a place called the Stronghold. The Stronghold was certainly not the city of David, even though that place was termed a stronghold. It is self-evident that this particular stronghold was someplace else. And the most logical place is that it was one that David had used pretty often in his past. Adullam, or more specifically, the cave located at Adullam. Now, was David fleeing for his life from the Philistines? Probably not. More likely, he was intentionally drawing them away from his family, from his private estate, to a place that he knew well from a strategic battle standpoint. Not only that, but certainly not all of the tribes would have been keen to fight the Philistines in order to defend King David's private estate, the city of David. In fact, after David inquires of God through the Urim and Thummim stones about just how he ought to proceed, the Philistines set up camp in the Rephaim Valley, which is just southwest of Jerusalem. And David takes his army and goes to a place called Baal Pratzim, which means the Lord of breaking through, and he defeats them there. Why would Hebrews incorporate the name Baal to commemorate a great military victory? Let me point out that in an earlier lesson, I explained the term Baal means Lord when you use it generically. That's all it means. Of course, we all know it was also used as a formal name for the chief Canaanite god. It's a word that's very similar to the Hebrew word Adonai, that generically means Lord or Master, and yet it's also a well-known title that the Hebrews commonly use to refer to God, to Yahweh. By David's day, the word Baal, that's little b, Baal, apparently had been adopted into the Hebrew language, and it simply meant Lord, like in master. It was not meant to indicate a pagan deity. So the name Baal Pratzim was not at all about honoring the Canaanite god Baal. Now, this use of the name Baal in this context gives us a good opportunity to pause a little bit and back away from this episode and look at the bigger picture of the condition of Israel at this time in their relationship to Yahweh. And while the use of the term Baal and the commemorative naming of this mountain place was undoubtedly not intended to honor the Canaanite god Baal, the problem is that this was just another subtle step in the perversion of the true Hebrew religion as defined by God through Moses on Mount Sinai. The term Baal had evolved from being entirely identified with everything God hated to simply being a common word used by Hebrews in everyday communicating. We have watched the Hebrews as this proverbial frog in the kettle slowly, over decades and over centuries, integrate seemingly small and insignificant pagan observances and people and customs and now words into their culture and into their worship practices. But as minuscule and unimportant as these changes were, they all add up. And by the time of David, we hardly hear the mention of the words Torah or Moses or law anymore. It's just missing from their vocabulary. The constitution of God's kingdom, His divine regulations and commandments had been infiltrated with traditions and common Middle Eastern social conventions to the point that other than for a few oddities, the Israelites were indistinguishable from any other Middle Eastern people. During David's ascent to the throne and his reign, his focus was not to purify their religion. That was never his focus. Rather, it was to unify the tribes to a powerful sovereign nation. David loved the Lord, but his hands were full. And all his faculties were aimed with tunnel vision towards finishing what Joshua had started over 300 years earlier. So with Solomon in time taking over from his father David, and then with a long line of various kings that followed them, the Hebrew religion became corrupted with paganism and social customs because the Word of God was no longer the authority. Now the authority was man-made doctrines. Now the authority was traditions. That's what ruled. In fact, it would be several hundred more years after David before a long-abandoned Torah scroll was discovered in a pile of rubble. And it was brought to the king, it was read to him, and that Hebrew king realized what had happened to Israel since that wonderful moment at Mount Sinai. That king was King Josiah. He tore his clothes in a sign of mourning and grief, and he ordered painful reforms to bring back proper Torah understanding, proper worship, therefore a restored relationship, hopefully, with Jehovah. It was the rediscovery of the Torah in Israel that brought about a true revival for Israel. And I'm convinced in all my being that we are living in such an age, if only we'll stand back far enough to recognize it. If Yeshua's church on earth is to experience a true revival that we so desperately need, then it is only going to be from the church rediscovering the Torah, falling on our faces in grief and mourning and repentance over our failure to heed God's instructions for all these years. Let those who have an ear to listen hear this. Verse 22 now describes the second attempt by the Philistines to reassert their control over David and Israel. And once more David consults with the Urim and Thummim stones, but this time the Lord instructs David not to make a frontal attack, but rather to circle around behind the Philistines. They're to wait in a grove of trees in hiding. And they're only to attack once they hear the sound of marching up in the treetops. And the marching sound would be David's indication that God had gone out ahead of them and already defeated the Philistines. Most rabbis explain that the sound of marching in the treetops was of God's heavenly angels moving into battle positions and rustling the leaves of the trees along the way. I don't know if that's exactly the case, but I have no doubts that this is meant spiritually more than physically. Wind rustles the leaves of trees, and wind is the usual biblical metaphor for a movement of God's Spirit. So while indeed it may have been God's angels going into battle against those evil spirits that fought for the Philistines, or whether it was God's Spirit preparing the way for victory, it was God who won this battle ahead of David. David did what the Lord instructed, and the Israelites achieved a great victory that day. The rule of the Philistines over Israel was broken after centuries of aggression and subjugation. Next time we'll take up chapter 6 and the incredibly meaningful move of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Okay? Please rise.